Alright then, ladies and gents, so as you can see, I've made some progress on basically getting as much stuff as I can inside. At this point, as you can see, I've got the cover on, everything is finally tucked away, but now the pump is in there, Wi-Fi card is in there. The only last part left really is to just be able to put the front plate adapter in. I still need to resolder a bunch of connections in there. And unfortunately, as I've realized, the cooling solution is just not quite adequate, so I'm going to be looking to use that CPU cooler that I was talking about in my previous session. Unfortunately, it seems after my last fill-up, it has decided to start shorting. I think there's still kind of some fluid somewhere that I'm not seeing, so I've got some desiccant packets on the way to essentially just put it into a Ziploc bag, let it sit for about 3 days or so, and hopefully they'll take out whatever moisture that happens to still be somewhere on the main board, because right now it just refuses to essentially power up. It just gives me a yellow light or orange light on the power supply and then quickly turns off. So that's pretty much indicative of the fact that there is indeed a short somewhere. Now, while that's happening, I've also decided to make some changes to the cooling system as it stands. So unfortunately, the kind of cooling plates or cold plates that you see in here, I'm just not getting the level of cooling that I was hoping for from this setup. I think that if I had, the space for a bigger heatsink that runs all the way across and with a little bit more surface area, as well as, basically sort of direct fan cooling onto it, it would perform a lot better. But due to the sort of space restriction that I'm working with, it just simply isn't possible. So that's, one thing that's going to need to get replaced, and I'll show you guys what that's going to get replaced with in a second here. But the other part that I want to kind of update everyone on is the buck converters have finally arrived. So you can see over here, the one that's going to be on the left in the red, that is going to be powering the triple 40mm fans, and then the one that you see on the right is there specifically for the pump. So now I will no longer need to use these basically gigantic, fan headers and an external power supply that can all run basically internally off of the Xbox. So the one that's going to be for the pump is going to be running off of the USB 5-volt rail, and then that's going to be stepping that up to 12 volts and outputting 6 amps as well. And then this guy over here takes the already 12-volt output from the actual fan header on the motherboard and then allows me to play with a little bit more current so I can run the fans and not overtax the internal components on the motherboard to allow me to actually, make things happen. But, last but not least, however, I've decided that I'm going to switch over the cooling system, so let me show you guys what I'm going to be doing. So right here is the Shuriken cooler from Scythe. It's the revision B of the Shuriken cooler, so basically prior to the redesign where they went on a slightly thicker stack of fins, basically underneath the main part of the heatsink, what ended up happening then is, they essentially beefed this whole thing up, but the original revision B version was extremely thin. The same, basically, fin density in terms of just the number of fins, but then not quite as thick. So this one is pretty much the same thickness as the cold plates that you see down there, which is nice. So the plan here is to basically chop off all of the copper piping, chop off the ends on them, and basically put in a couple of fittings. I don't remember exactly what the internal dimensions are, and then essentially just connect that to a GPU kind of header that has 5 outputs on it. So I'll be feeding basically into these 5 connections in here, and then essentially recirculating that into the other 5 pipes on the other side by using the turns in the copper piping, hopefully. Assuming that I'm able to actually get them to turn the way I want them to, this should work. Now, I don't know how much of a flow restriction this is going to be right now. It's honestly kind of hard to say. But, hopefully after clearing out these pipes, because again, they're meant to carry, pretty much a special type of fluid inside of them, and they have these little chambers built in that have basically a bunch of packing in them, so I'm going to have to remove the packing somehow so that I allow for maximum flow volume through these copper heat pipes to allow the coolant to actually run through this entire loop. And hopefully, given that right now I have a lot more, surface area for the heatsink, this will, in theory, provide basically a better cooling environment for this whole setup. Now, with that said, the downside here is that I'm going to need to create a fan shroud. So I'll have to probably 3D print that, design it, 3D print it, so that I'm actually able to get airflow from the fans that are, facing this way, and direct that upwards onto this heatsink and exhaust that out the top of the case. That way I'm not blowing hot air back down onto the CPU water block, which is more or less what was happening before. So in essence, I had hot air from the fins on the heat sinks traveling back towards the block, obviously far from ideal. So I think that having the full shroud cover in this situation and exhausting the air all the way out the top should provide a slightly better cooling solution, provided this whole kind of setup works, as unorthodox as it is. But again, you got to remember the really tight spacing in here. Basically, there's about 12 millimeters or so, maybe 13, give or take, to play with in terms of spacing on the heatsink itself that I can do above the water block, because again, this case is incredibly tiny. Now, I could drop down some of the standoffs on the motherboard to give me a little bit more clearance, but and I may have to do that just so I can get the shroud to fit. But as it stands, that's the current plan, while hopefully the motherboard ends up surviving. We'll see what happens with that, since I don't really know how bad the extent of the short was when it did happen. Seems to be a common case with this build so far. This is the second board that's shorted on me so far, so hopefully I won't have to replace the whole thing, but again, we will see. And so I'll give you guys an update once the board hopefully comes back to life, and once I've got this heatsink pretty much under control and handled, so that we can move on to the next part of hopefully setting up the loop again, for now like the 10th time or so that I've drained it and filled it back up, etc., doing tests. And I'm also waiting on basically a new fitting for the drain. So the brass fittings that I got ended up being just a little bit too tall, so they don't fit inside the case, and I don't want to have like a valve opening sticking out the side of the case because it just looks really ugly. So I got the most low profile basically drain valve that I could from XSPC, and that's on the way, so that I'll be able to actually properly drain the valve, drain the system, and also so that I can actually use my little vacuum pump again to help drain the whole loop faster without having to do a whole tilt and tilt back methodology that typically is employed when draining loops like this. So again, that's on the way, and that'll be getting the hookup as well once I get sort of the rest of this cooling system sorted. So stick around, check out my next vlog for this build, and we'll see you guys in the next video.